So in the Mega Man franchise, one of the big draws is the bosses, and that's especially true for the X series. As much as I love the Robot Masters from Classic, not limiting the designs to just humanoid forms really expands what Capcom is able to do with them, from mammals, to sea creatures, to bugs, to whatever the heck Bit and Byte fuse into. It gets me thinking, what are my favorite bosses from each game and why? A few rules before we begin. First, I won't be going over the handheld titles here, since they typically just recycle past encounters. Also, I'll only be picking from the Mavericks in each game's main 8 stages, the ones that get the little profile picks, because otherwise some recurring characters might get multiple spots, and it'd be really unfair to X2's, 5's, and kind of 6's rogue galleries to have to go up against Zero. While things like stage and music might net some bosses a few bonus points, I'll be judging based mostly on design, fight, weapon, and in some instances lore. With the criteria out of the way, this is a list of the Explosion's favorite boss from each of the mainline X titles. The original X game might just be the hardest for me to pick a favorite from. The designs are not only top tier and really interesting, but as the game I played the most, both as a kid and still as an adult, it holds maximum nostalgia for me. Still, no matter how much I want to give it to the full roster, there can be only one, and that's Boomer Kuwanger. This guy just has everything going for him. First, there's his level. All the stages here have excellent designs, so while I'm not giving his credit for that, I am for the sort of atmosphere it provides. You start at the bottom of a tower and work your way up, which is very satisfying to do. You are overcoming a challenge indeed. It also adds a bit of personality to the guy at the top, which is great in a game with little dialogue, imparting Kuwanger with a sense of haughtiness and arrogance, as he literally looms over you. As for the Maverick himself, he has a very sleek and lithe design, making him seem like he has no superfluous parts. I'm also a big fan of Cutman, and his razor boomerang that he tosses around is reminiscent of his head scissors. For his fight, he can feel somewhat overwhelming, appearing and disappearing around the room, and his boomerang making it so that you're not even safe if you try to hide in the top corner to get your bearings. If you use his weakness, the homing missiles though, he's really manageable, making it very satisfying to just completely take out his teleportation advantage and rewarding you for your proper preparation. It also just is really fun to say his name, Boomer Kuwanger. Boomer Kuwanger. Boomer Kuwanger. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. The weapon he gives you might just be the best in the game. It's a decent choice from just fight to fight, with good ammo consumption, even refilling itself if the Rang misses and returns to you. It can grab power-ups that are just out of your reach, giving it good utility, and against 2 bosses that aren't even weak to the attack, Launch Octopus and Flame Mammoth, you can still use it to dismember them and cut a move out of their repertoire. It rules. X2 is Magna Centipede. First off, as the name implies, he's a centipede, which I like in concept. Might not be so keen on them if I live somewhere with an abundance of them, but I happen to like characters and critters with extra or stretchy limbs. While they didn't go too crazy with this, giving Magna Centipede only 4 arms, that's still 2 more than I have, so I like it. I'm also a bit of a weeb and like that he's a ninja. The theming is very strong on this point, his level encouraging stealth to get through, and at one point, sensors trying to gather information on X, which they then use to make a sub-boss stronger. For the boss encounter itself, Centipede throws Magnetized Shuriken at you while teleporting around, which should sound familiar, as well as poisoning you if he can get his tail on you. If you hit him with his weakness though, the Silk Shot, that knocks off his tail and eliminates this option. The weapon you get for victory, the Magnet Mines, are projectiles that you can steer a bit, which is handy and also makes not just the boss that it's primarily weak to, Crystal Snail, go from a colossal pain to an amusing exchange, but also makes the Agile rematch a good deal easier. With him being the ceiling, it'd be hard to attack him with much else. X3's is Gravity Beetle. I swear, I don't have a weird obsession with bugs, they just got a lot of the cool stuff. His stage music is awesome, giving it a feeling of epicness. He's a Rhinoceros Beetle, which, like I said, not a bug fanatic, but it's still pretty neat. He's also Boomer Kuwanger's brother, looking to get revenge, so he gets bonus points there too. The big thing though is his power. Gravity manipulation is cool. Creating black holes is also cool. When X uses it, he can just kinda pitch the gravity wells out there and let them do their thing, making them quite effective. It gets even better though when he charges it up and flips things around. Getting the upgrade that requires this power is something I always look forward to in a run. For X4, my pick is Split Mushroom. First, it's just pretty unusual for us to get a Maverick that isn't an animal, and just look at him. He's a little guy, yet he struts around like he owns the place. In his fight, I like how he can create doppelgangers and use a spore-like powder to make you see double. I also like the little whoas he lets out as he hops around. I also appreciate how he's just a straight-up Maverick in the game, wearing Sigma's emblem and everything. While I like Repliflors and appreciate the nuance that having them as primary antagonists create, at the same time, I do get a bit of narrative whiplash when the game tries to sell me on them not being bad guys, it just being a difference of ideals, and then having me fight several members of the group that are truly terrible people. Split Mushroom is evil and cruel, they don't try to convince me otherwise, and then just drop an anecdote about how he killed a guy's family right in front of him, and then put out his eyes so that would be the last sight he would ever see. Looking at you, Walrus and Stingray. As for his power, the Soul Body is a pretty neat ability for X, giving him a nice little buffer in front, and while it might not be the most practical, creating a duplicate you can move around as instead by charging the weapon up is interesting. For Zero though, taking Mushroom down is a game changer, giving him a double jump which is huge for getting around, and the Spinny Dings, which is one of the primary techniques for taking down enemies, especially bosses. For X5, I like Volt Kraken. His stage music is beautiful. I could listen to it on loop for hours. And squids are one of my favorite animals, so he'd probably cinch the spot for just that. Part of it's the extra limb thing again, of which he has a few tentacles he can use to whip you with. I also like characters that float around, not fly, as if they're just ignoring gravity. He's hitting a few of my go-tos, isn't he? Along those lines, he was also friends with Launch Octopus, my second favorite boss from the original, for an honorable mention, which does nicely to make the titles feel more interconnected. His fight is a more vertical affair, which is interesting if a little tricky, and tests your aerials and wall climbing, as well as just general positioning. The Tri-Thunder he gives you strikes in 3 directions, like you might expect, which is good for coverage, and also tends to be the weakness of some of the harder bosses in the game, like the Shadow Devil and Sigma, so you really learn to appreciate it. And on top of all that, his name is so frickin' cool. Volt Kraken, named after a beast of legend. It just sounds powerful. It'd be a crime to change it. You might be able to guess who I went with for X6. Infinity Moginion is a small guy that creates clones of himself and floats around his boss room. For his design, he has some semi-translucent surfaces, giving you a glimpse of some of his inner workings, a visual effect I really like with electronics. And if you don't believe me when I say I don't have a bug obsession, I think he's also supposed to be a water fleet, so he's got that going for him too. Beyond all that though is his level. Sure, it's a mess with a ton of visual noise and attacks coming at you, like much of X6, but more important is the giant robot that follows you in the background through the stage. As a fan of Gundam and mecha in general, I can appreciate a boss with a similar interest. When you enter the boss room after defeating it, Infinity gets mad at you and refers to it as a she, making me wonder what his relationship to her was. Was she a friend, a colleague, his pet, his current project, or his girlfriend? While I'm pretty sure she was his latest creation, my headcanon is that last option, because I like couples with a major size difference. It's just so funny to me when it looks like they could perform a fastball special, and this would kinda be the extreme of this. Please don't ruin my dreams. X7, it's Tornado Tunyon, and half of it is his name. It's really fun to say, Tornado Tunyon. I love alliteration. I also like his goofish, cartoonish, and hopefully not problematic accent, and how his whole thing is just dancing around the battle arena, making him a very silly boss. He also seems to be the member of Red Alert that was closest to Axel, who I've grown to like recently, and seems to be the only one besides Axel not to drink the Sigma Kool-Aid in the group, making him a more likable character among the bosses in this title. I also find his concept kind of interesting, him being like an ogre and having layers. He uses this to defend and attack, so taking out some of his so-called petals not only opens him up to strikes, but also gives him less to attack with. Unfortunately, with as quick as they come back, what this largely does is drag out the fight, but hey, it was a neat idea anyway. The weapon you get from him, the Volt Tornado, is one of the more functional in the game, and if you use it with Zero, dashing forward before leaping up and creating the electrical cylinder, it's actually kinda fun. Kinda. For X8, I really like Optic Sunflower. He's just such a strange one. When it comes to the other non-animal Mavericks, I kinda get it. There's something insidious about mushrooms, sorry Mario, And it's a common saying that every rose has its thorns concerning Spike Rose Raid, but a sunflower? There's nothing threatening about that. And yet, not only is it a boss here, but they're also the one that gets the giant frickin' laser. You'd expect the flower to be more dainty, but ironically, he has the most unsubtle weapon in the game. And I love the contrast. He gets some cool light effects beyond the laser though, like the grid spheres he throws to capture you in. He also has a few other of my staple likes, like teleporting about and making decoys. Beyond that, he just has an interesting design, being long and lanky and having fingers that look more fluid than segmented. I also like more gender-fluid characters, and Optic Sunflower is perhaps the most feminine of all the Mavericks in the series. From his English dub voice to his stance to, yes, the obvious flower motif, I would have assumed he was a woman if all the references I looked at didn't refer to him as a he. Because of all this, Sunflower is not just my favorite boss from X8, but one of my favorites overall. He'd be a contender for top with some of the original X Mavericks and Split Mushroom, at least outside of story bosses. And I lied. Twice. I said I was only going to name my favorites of the stage bosses, but it'd be too much of a waste not to discuss some of the other people you fight outside of that, so I'm throwing in a story boss section. And it was actually this, even more so than the original X, that was the hardest to decide. Lumine was an interesting curveball of a final boss, with rockin' tunes and a really cool fight. I adore Iris and always want an excuse to talk about her. Zero is the coolest man who ever lived. All of these are strong contenders, and I'd feel guilty if I didn't at least mention them as honorable mentions, but from a purely boss character standpoint, my favorite is Vile, or Vava, which is more fun to say. On the design side of things, I'll say it, he looks like a Boba Fett knockoff, with his armor and T-shaped visor, but hey, the look is cool, and as someone who was once an edgy childhood Star Wars fan, I like it. This also gives him an air of mystery, since we have no idea what he looks like underneath. Is he a human-looking Reploid like X and Zero? Maybe one with more otherworldly qualities like Sigma? Is he more skeletal, just a collection of parts held together by his armor, with that functioning as his skin? In his first iteration, he has purple armor, my favorite color, and in his second, he looks more psychotic, an extra missile launcher on his one shoulder, extra edgy flare on his legs, and one red eye glowing out from his visor in some art. For his third, he takes more military camo colors and has thick wires that look almost like dreadlocks coming from the back of his head. He has a decent bit of variety in his appearances, yet each are instantly recognizable as Vile. As for weapons, his most prominent is his shoulder-mounted cannon. Shoulder-mounted anything is pretty unique, but that it's asymmetrical really makes a statement. You'd think it'd make him off-balance, but it really doesn't seem to bother him. Maybe he was designed not to care. He's also been known to deploy hidden armaments from some of his joints, giving him an underhanded quality. Each iteration also uses ride armor at some point. These are a staple of the series, always exciting to see, and fighting an enemy in one that doesn't just break in a few hits is always thrilling. Plus, it further establishes Vile as a bad guy, and nothing but, since it shows how he's more interested in destruction and winning than a fair fight. For the battles themselves, in the first X title, he feels like an insurmountable wall, and with good reason, you having to face him in 2 unwinnable fights before he's finally dragged out of his ride armor, and even then, he's still kinda tricky to deal with, and it also required Zero sacrificing himself just to get that far. In the second, he's somehow more brutal, using ride armor with spiked hands and throwing some extra weapons on himself. And in the third, he shows up randomly, except for the last few encounters, largely to get in your way and be an annoyance. And I think that's why I like him as an antagonist so much. While he makes a strong impression each time he shows up, it's that he's recurring that really cements his place in the series. While I'm sure there are perfectly logical reasons as to why he keeps getting revived, they're never really discussed that much, making it feel like he's returning from death each time out of spite. He seems to really have it in for the Hunters, especially X, the two having a particularly antagonistic relationship with the other. This is another thing I can't really seem to find a specific reason for, but given that Vile was known for his destructive and brutal tactics, even when he was still a Maverick Hunter, and X is a pacifist, the two are polar opposites and probably disgusted each other. But heck, given that it's never outright stated, it could even be something as petty as Vile draining a sub-tank X was saving in the break room, or the girl Vile liked having a crush on X instead. There's no limit to how serious or stupid their grudge could be, but one way or another, Vile's a force of pure hatred and my top pick for whose ass I want to kick in the X series. If X9 ever happens, I'll be waiting with bated breath to see if I get another chance at it. And you didn't think I'd forget Sigma, did you? My favorite Sigma fight is from X4, just because of how learnable it is. He has 3 stages here, the first being a little tricky at first, before you learn the pattern and what he's weak to, but when you do, it becomes a mere formality. The second is pretty iconic, being the second most recognizable form outside of his original appearance, and has a good variety of attacks. Some are pretty hard to deal with, but if you know what you're doing, you can bait some of the ones that are easier to get around and really take Sigma to town. And his third stage has 3 forms. 2 of them have health bars and the other is just there to get in your way. Each has 2 or 3 attacks and have enough tells that you can predict what he's going to do. When I started playing the X series again, I remembered enough to take out the first stage of Sigma, no problem, but the second gave me some issues. When I did a second playthrough with Zero though, I learned how to get through that one with little to no damage as well. For the third form, it was all about learning the patterns and paying attention to cues, and I think on one of my most recent runs, I managed to clear the whole battle without a sub-tank. My favorite type of boss battles are those that you can learn and get down, no RNG bullcrap making it a mix of luck and skill to get through. Most battles are a mixture of both, and as long as it doesn't skew too heavily on the side of chance, I don't mind too much. Here though, Phase 1 follows a very specific pattern, Phase 2 you can manipulate to make him do what works for you, and while there's some RNG in what attack he'll use, you have enough warning with the flow of battle for the third one that it isn't just left to fate. Maybe a little bit when it comes to whether Sigma sucks or blows. While I like a lot of the finales in the X game, this one just takes the cake for me. And as a bonus, X Command Mission, where I favor Dr. Psyche. He's cartoonishly evil, talking about higher ideals while in the middle of looting and kidnapping, though not being an uncomfortable kind of cruel like a certain Triceratops. He's also got a mad scientist thing going on, tapping away wildly at computers and even doing a crazy laugh while in battle. He also has a very neat design, being largely white and simple looking, yet still looking kind of wild with the contrast of his glowing pink dome and several different colors adorning his lower half. He has a second form, Mad Nautilus, one of the few bosses that does in the game. This fight happens about halfway through the title, marking the occasion nicely and building up a lot of excitement for the end of the chapter, X's theme playing for the second half of the fight. Plus, it's a Nautilus, so I like it for similar reasons like I like squids, and the way Psyche's head pops off and then situates itself in a place of prominence on his new, larger form feels like a nice callback to the Sigma encounter in the original X. So those are my favorite bosses from the X series. You know, with there being 8 games and there typically being 8 bosses per title, you could use this list to make my own personal Hall of Fame game, maybe a Mega Man X All-Stars. For Sigma stages, you could use Vile and Mad Nautilus as stage bosses, with maybe Rangda Bangda thrown in if you needed a third, since it's pretty iconic, and Statue of Liberty Sigma included as an intro stage boss, since it's memorable and actually pretty funny. But hey, that's only if you agree with my picks. Please feel welcome to include your own favorites in the comments. Completely understandable if you want to skip games that you haven't played or just plain don't like, though if you need help deciding on X7, Flame Hyanar does have meme appeal. With all that said, thanks for watching, and if you like the video and Mega Man content in general, perhaps consider subscribing. For everlasting peace and the like,